Well, this is it. The court found no legal or factual basis to overturn the jury's conviction of Sean Combs on 2 counts of violating the Mann Act and therefore denied his motions for acquittal and a new trial. All right, so after the guilty verdict dropped, Sean Combs' lawyers decided to try something truly, unbelievably wild. You'd think they'd hit back with some genius legal argument, right? Well, their first big move was to tell the judge that the whole conviction was bogus because the jury was given a flawed definition of the word prostitution. They claimed the jurors were given the wrong instructions on what the word even means. And here's the kicker, the part that makes this whole thing sound like a prank. The definition they were complaining about? Yeah, that was their own. I'm not kidding. They literally wrote it down, handed it to the court, and the judge said, "Okay, looks good." The jury then used their exact words to find Combs guilty. It was like giving someone a recipe, they follow it perfectly, and then you sue them because you don't like the cake. It was a complete Uno reverse card moment in a federal courtroom, and it failed spectacularly. The judge saw it for what it was, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to undo a problem they made themselves. But believe it or not, trying to blame their own work was just the warm-up act. Their next argument tried to create a brand new loophole in the law. So, with the blame our own definition strategy dead on arrival, Combs' lawyers pivoted to their next brilliant idea. They argued that for this to be a real crime under the Mann Act, Combs himself needed to have a financial motive. Their logic was basically, look, he wasn't a pimp trying to make a buck, he was just a guy paying for services for his own, personal gratification. They were trying to paint a picture that this wasn't a business transaction, so it couldn't be illegal. It's a clever-sounding argument, right? It separates the guy paying for it all from the traditional image of someone running an enterprise for profit. But the judge was not having it. He basically looked at the law and said, "Show me where it says that." The Mann Act only cares about one thing, whether you transported a person with the intent for them to engage in prostitution. It doesn't have a little asterisk that says, "and you must also be getting paid for your troubles." The judge made it clear the law doesn't care if you're doing it for cash, for fun, or for any other reason. The crime is in the intent, not your bank account. So the whole "I wasn't getting paid" excuse got tossed out just as fast. But that led them to their most technical, hair-splitting argument yet, one that tried to prove the whole thing wasn't prostitution at all. All right, with the financial motive argument completely shot down, Combs' team had to get even more creative. They rolled out their next big idea, which was basically a brand new, custom-made definition of prostitution. They argued that for it to be the real deal, it has to be a strictly two-person transaction. You know, person A pays person B, and person B performs the service directly for person A. End of story. Since Combs was paying men to be with his girlfriends, it was a three-party situation, which, according to them, meant it wasn't technically prostitution. It was a loophole so narrow you could barely see it. They were trying to tell a federal judge that if you aren't the direct recipient of the service you're paying for, you're in the clear. But the judge immediately saw how absurd this was. He pointed out that this logic would pretty much erase prostitution as a crime. Following their rule, you could walk into a brothel, pay the owner at the front desk, and nothing illegal would have happened because you didn't hand the cash directly to the person in the back room. The judge basically said that's not how the world works, and it's definitely not how the law works. This wasn't some clever legal interpretation, it was an attempt to rewrite the dictionary for a party of one. With all their attempts to twist the definition of the crime failing miserably, they had to change their entire strategy. They decided to stop arguing about the law and start arguing that what Combs did wasn't a crime at all. It was art. So when twisting the law didn't work, what was plan B? Simple, just claim it wasn't a crime in the first place. No, what Combs was doing wasn't illegal, it was art. They actually stood in court and argued that Combs was an amateur pornographer. Because he was filming some of these encounters, they claimed he wasn't paying for intimacy, he was creating a piece of art. And since art is protected by the First Amendment, you can't convict him for it. It's a pretty gutsy move, trying to hide behind freedom of speech. But the judge wasn't buying a single ticket to that show. First off, he pointed out that real filmmakers, usually ask for permission before they start rolling. Evidence showed Combs often just started filming without any heads up or consent. And what was Combs doing while creating this supposed masterpiece? According to testimony, he was often getting his own rocks off. He wasn't behind the camera like some director, he was a very, very active audience member. Sometimes he even jumped in and participated himself. The judge put it all together and said, let's be real, this wasn't about making a movie, this was about personal gratification. Calling it art was just a fancy excuse to try and wrap illegal activity in a constitutional flag. So the "I'm an artist" defense was dead on arrival. But if you think that was the only time they tried to use the Constitution as a get-out-of-jail-free card, you'd be wrong. They had a few more tricks up their sleeve. So after the "I'm an artist" defense got completely laughed out of court, Combs's team just started chucking the rest of the Constitution at the wall to see what would stick. They weren't just arguing about one right, they were arguing about the law itself. First, they said the law was void for vagueness. That's some high-dollar lawyer speak for, this law is so confusing a normal person can't possibly understand what's illegal. They claimed that since the definition of prostitution has shifted over the last century, nobody could really be sure what it means today. But the judge's reaction was pretty much, give me a break. He said prostitution isn't some deep philosophical mystery, it means paying for adult fun time. He made it clear that what Combs did was squarely in the bullseye of what anyone would call prostitution. Then, for their grand finale, they claimed his due process rights were violated, basically trying to invent a constitutional right to pay for intimacy. But the judge just pointed to the Supreme Court, which had already made it crystal clear that any right to privacy does not include prostitution. They literally drew a line in the sand years ago, and Combs's lawyers were trying to pretend it wasn't there. With all their legal and constitutional arguments now sitting in the garbage, they had only one person left to blame, the jury. All right, so with every single legal argument shot down, Combs's lawyers were officially out of technicalities. They had no choice but to go for the ultimate Hail Mary. They argued for a brand new trial. And their reason was a real piece of work. They claimed the jury had been brainwashed. Not literally, of course, but that was the gist. Their theory was called prejudicial spillover. Here's how it's supposed to work. Combs was on trial for a bunch of things, right? The really heavy charges were racketeering and trafficking, and then he had the lesser Mann Act charges. The jury heard a ton of nasty evidence about all that stuff. So the lawyers argued that even though the jury found him not guilty of those big crimes, all that ugly evidence was still rattling around in their heads. They claimed the jury was so disgusted by what they heard that they just had to convict him of something, so they settled for the lesser charges, not based on the evidence for those charges, but out of pure anger. It's a pretty cynical view, basically saying the jury couldn't control their emotions and just needed to punish him one way or another. This was their last hope, a final claim that the verdict wasn't fair, not because of the law, but because of the jury itself. It was a bold accusation, and it set the stage for the judge's final and most brilliant shutdown of the entire case. And this, right here, is where the judge delivered the ultimate legal smackdown. Combs's lawyers argued the jury was hopelessly biased, so blinded by anger that they convicted him unfairly. The judge's response was a masterclass in logic. He didn't just disagree, he used the jury's own verdict to completely dismantle their argument. He pointed out the one glaring hole in their theory. If the jury was so prejudiced and desperate to punish Combs, why in the world did they acquit him of the most serious charges? The judge made it clear that the split verdict wasn't a sign of prejudice. It was a sign of a smart, careful jury doing its job. They listened to all the evidence for racketeering and trafficking and decided the government didn't prove its case. Then they looked at the evidence for the Mann Act and decided it did. In a moment of perfect irony, the judge took the one thing Combs was celebrating, his acquittal on the major charges, and turned it into the very weapon that destroyed his last hope. They tried to argue the jury was unfair, and the judge used the jury's own careful fairness to deny his appeal. And just to rub it in, he added that the evidence against Combs on the Mann Act counts was overwhelming on its own. It was the final nail in the coffin for any chance of a do-over.
So, when you lay it all out, it's pretty clear what happened. This wasn't just a simple no from the judge. It was a complete top-to-bottom demolition of every single argument Sean Combs' legal team could dream up. They tried to blame their own mistakes, they tried to rewrite the dictionary, they tried to wrap themselves in the American flag and call it art, and when all of that failed, they tried to blame the jury for being too smart. At every single turn, the judge was there to meet them with cold, hard logic. He didn't just deny their motions, he explained in painstaking detail why they were wrong, why they were desperate, and in some cases, why they were just plain ridiculous. They threw everything they had at the wall, the law, the Constitution, even the jury's own intelligence, and the judge made sure none of it stuck. With every legal excuse and desperate gambit now officially in the trash bin, Combs' conviction stands, and the road ahead looks like a dead end. There are no more loopholes to find, and no one left to blame.
Just the date, the 3rd of October. What you guys think? Will he be sentenced or walk away like nothing happened? Let me know down in the comments. Like this video and subscribe. Thanks for watching.